Tommy Blake had always been the kind of guy who solved problems with his fists. At 28 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands that told the story of years working construction sites across London. His co-workers used to joke that Tommy could start a fight in an empty room, and honestly, they weren't wrong. But this week was different. This week everything had gone completely wrong, and Tommy felt like the whole world was against him. It started on Monday when his boss called him into the tiny office that smelled like cigarettes and old coffee. Tommy knew something was up the moment he walked in and saw the serious look on his boss's face. "Listen, Tommy," his boss had said, not even looking him in the eye. "We've had some complaints about your temper on the job site. That incident with the new guy last week, well, the company can't have that kind of behavior anymore. We're letting you go." Tommy felt his face getting hot. The new guy had been asking stupid questions and slowing everyone down. All Tommy did was tell him to shut up and do his job properly. Maybe he pushed him a little, but that was just construction site talk. Everyone knew that. "You can't fire me for that," Tommy had argued, his voice getting louder. "I've been working here for 3 years. I'm one of your best workers." But his boss just shook his head and handed him an envelope with his final paycheck. "Clean out your locker, Tommy. Security will escort you out." Walking out of that building with a cardboard box of his stuff felt like the most embarrassing moment of his life. The other workers just stared at him, and he could hear them whispering as he passed. Some of them looked relieved, which made Tommy even angrier. By Tuesday, things got worse. His girlfriend Lisa, who he'd been dating for 2 years, decided she couldn't handle his anger problems anymore. She came to his small apartment and started packing her clothes while he sat on the couch, still in shock from losing his job. "I can't do this anymore, Tommy," she said, folding her favorite sweater into a suitcase. "Every time something goes wrong, you get violent. I'm scared of you sometimes, and that's not how relationships should be." Tommy tried to convince her to stay. He promised he would change, that losing his job was a wake-up call. But Lisa had heard these promises before. She'd seen him punch walls when he got frustrated. She'd watched him get into bar fights over nothing. She'd even seen him yell at old ladies on the bus when they moved too slowly. "I love you," she said, tears in her eyes. "But I love myself more. I need to be safe." After she left, Tommy's apartment felt huge and empty. He sat in his old leather chair, the one his dad had given him, and tried to figure out what to do next. The silence was so loud it hurt his ears. For the first time in years, Tommy felt completely alone. Wednesday brought another piece of bad news. His landlord, Mr. Peterson, knocked on his door with an official-looking letter. Tommy owed 2 months of rent, and with no job, he had no way to pay it. The letter gave him 30 days to come up with the money or face eviction. "I'm sorry, Tommy," Mr. Peterson said. He was a nice old man who had always been patient with late payments before. "But the building owner is cracking down. I can't make any more exceptions." Tommy crumpled up the letter and threw it across the room after Mr. Peterson left. Everything he had worked for was falling apart, and he felt powerless to stop it. The walls of his apartment seemed to be closing in on him. That's when Tommy started drinking. Not just a beer after work like he used to, but serious drinking. He would wake up around noon, walk to the corner shop, buy a bottle of cheap whiskey, and drink until he passed out on his couch. The alcohol made the anger feel less sharp, but it also made everything else fuzzy and unclear. By Thursday morning, Tommy had been drinking for almost 2 days straight. His head pounded like someone was hitting it with a hammer, and his mouth tasted like old socks. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. His eyes were red and puffy, his hair was a mess, and he hadn't shaved in days. The empty bottles on his kitchen counter told the story of how low he had fallen. Tommy grabbed the last half-full bottle and took a long drink, even though it was barely 10 in the morning. The whiskey burned his throat, but it also made the terrible feelings in his chest feel a little less painful. Around noon, Tommy decided he needed fresh air. He couldn't stay in his apartment anymore, surrounded by reminders of his failures. The rain outside matched his mood perfectly, gray, cold, and miserable. He put on his old construction jacket and started walking with no particular destination in mind. The streets of London were busy as always, full of people who seemed to have their lives figured out. Everyone looked like they had somewhere important to be, while Tommy just wandered aimlessly with his hands in his pockets and alcohol on his breath. He passed office buildings full of people in nice suits, coffee shops where friends laughed together, and bus stops where families waited patiently. Everyone seemed happy and content, which made Tommy feel even more angry and left out. Why did everyone else get to have normal lives while his was falling apart? The alcohol in his system made every small annoyance feel huge. When someone walked too slowly in front of him, Tommy felt rage building in his chest. When a car splashed puddle water near his feet, he wanted to punch the driver. When he heard people laughing loudly, he took it personally, as if they were laughing at him. As the afternoon wore on, Tommy found himself in the area around Buckingham Palace. He'd never been much interested in royal stuff, but the alcohol made him curious about all the tourists taking pictures. Maybe seeing something different would help him forget his problems for a while. But instead of feeling better, watching all the happy tourists made Tommy feel even more isolated and angry. These people were probably on vacation, spending money they had from jobs they hadn't lost. They probably had families and friends waiting for them at home. They probably had normal, peaceful lives that Tommy could only dream about now. The combination of alcohol, anger, and 3 days of bad news was like a dangerous mixture waiting to explode. Tommy didn't know it yet, but he was about to make a decision that would change his life forever. All he knew was that he was tired of feeling powerless, tired of being ignored, and tired of everyone else seeming so happy while his world crumbled around him. As he walked toward the palace gates, Tommy had no idea that he was about to have an encounter that would teach him the hardest lesson of his life. The crowd around Buckingham Palace was much thicker than Tommy had expected when he stumbled through the gates that afternoon. Tourists from every corner of the world had gathered near the famous black iron railings, all pointing their cameras and phones at anything that looked remotely royal or official. The mix of languages created a constant buzz of excitement as families posed for photos and tour guides shared historical facts. Tommy pushed through the crowd without much care for the people around him. The whiskey he had been drinking all morning made everything feel distant and unreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold in front of him. A Japanese family quickly moved aside when they caught a whiff of alcohol on his breath, and a mother with 2 small children guided them away from his path. The rain had stopped, but the gray London sky still hung heavy overhead, matching Tommy's dark mood perfectly. He wasn't really sure why he had wandered toward the palace in the first place. Maybe he was curious about all the tourist activity, or maybe he just needed to be somewhere that felt different from his empty apartment and the streets where everyone seemed to have their lives figured out. That's when he saw him, standing there like a statue come to life. Near the main entrance to the palace stood one of the famous Queen's Guards that Tommy had seen in countless movies and postcards, but seeing one in person was completely different from any picture. The guard looked almost impossibly perfect, like something that had been designed rather than born. His red uniform jacket was so bright it seemed to glow even under the cloudy sky. Every gold button was polished to mirror brightness, and the black trousers had a razor-sharp crease running down each leg. The enormous black bearskin hat added at least a foot to his already impressive height, making him look like some kind of giant from a fairy tale. The guard's name was David Chen, though Tommy had no way of knowing that. David was 24 years old and had been serving in this prestigious position for 8 months. Before being selected for the Queen's Guard, he had spent 2 challenging years in regular army service, including 6 months deployed overseas in a conflict zone that had tested his courage and character in ways most people could never imagine. David stood with his rifle held at exactly the correct angle, his black boots so perfectly polished they reflected the faces of tourists taking pictures. His posture was flawless, shoulders back, chin up, eyes focused on some distant point that only he could see. Every aspect of his appearance and behavior had been drilled into him through months of intensive training. But what struck Tommy most was David's complete stillness. He didn't blink excessively, didn't shift his weight from foot to foot, didn't acknowledge the dozens of people taking his photograph. He stood like a monument to discipline and professionalism, representing centuries of British military tradition. "Look at this guy," Tommy muttered to himself, loud enough that several nearby tourists turned to look at him, standing there like he owns the place. The alcohol in Tommy's system was making him interpret David's professional composure as something entirely different. Where others saw dedication and discipline, Tommy saw arrogance. Where others admired the tradition and ceremony, Tommy saw someone showing off. An elderly British couple who had been admiring David's uniform moved away when they heard Tommy's slurred commentary. They exchanged concerned glances and positioned themselves on the other side of the crowd, clearly uncomfortable with Tommy's aggressive tone and the smell of alcohol surrounding him. David, of course, was trained to be aware of everything happening in his immediate area. Part of his job was to identify potential problems before they became serious situations. He had noticed Tommy the moment the man started speaking loudly and critically, and he could smell the alcohol from several feet away. This wasn't unusual. David dealt with intoxicated tourists on a regular basis, especially during busy periods when the palace attracted large crowds. His training had been very specific about how to handle such situations, maintain position, ignore provocation, and allow security personnel to deal with any actual problems that might arise. But Tommy's alcohol-clouded brain was reading David's professional silence as something completely different. To Tommy, the guard's failure to respond looked like snobbery, like he thought he was too good to acknowledge regular people. "Hey there, toy soldier," Tommy called out, his voice cutting through the general chatter of the tourist crowd. "I'm talking to you." Several families with children began moving away from the area as Tommy's voice grew louder and more aggressive. Some responsible parents recognized the signs of a potentially dangerous situation and started gathering their belongings to leave, but others seemed fascinated by the developing confrontation, pulling out phones to record whatever might happen next. David's training immediately kicked into higher gear. He had been taught to expect exactly this kind of behavior from visitors who had been drinking. The standard procedure was crystal clear: provide no reaction whatsoever, maintain ceremonial position, and trust the security system to handle any escalation. His lack of response was actually a sign of incredible professionalism and self-control, but Tommy interpreted it as weakness or contempt. "Oh, you're too special to talk to normal people?" Tommy stepped closer, weaving slightly as the alcohol affected his balance. "Think you're some kind of war hero standing there in your fancy dress-up clothes?" A security guard positioned about 60 yards away had noticed the developing situation and started walking in their direction, but he was moving at a casual pace. This type of incident happened several times each week. Tourists who had been drinking would get too close to the guards or make inappropriate comments. Usually a polite conversation and gentle redirection was enough to resolve the problem. Tommy was now standing close, enough to David that he could see the individual threads. In the red wool of his jacket and the perfect shine of his boots, David could smell the whiskey on Tommy's breath and see the anger burning in his bloodshot eyes. But his military training had taught him to remain calm under much more serious pressure than this. Still, David remained absolutely motionless. His breathing stayed controlled and even. His grip on his rifle never wavered, and his eyes continued staring at that distant point beyond the crowd. This was what he had been trained to do, and he executed it with the precision of a professional soldier. "You know what I think?" Tommy continued, his voice getting louder and attracting even more attention from the growing crowd of onlookers. "I think you've probably never been in a real fight in your entire life." More people were starting to film now, sensing that they might be witnessing something dramatic that they could share with friends back home. Some held their phones up high to get the best angle, while others tried to be more discreet about recording the confrontation. Tommy began circling around David slowly, like a predator studying its prey. The contrast between the two men was striking. David in his perfect uniform representing order and tradition, Tommy in his wrinkled clothes and disheveled appearance representing chaos and personal failure. "Are you even listening to me?" Tommy demanded, stopping directly in front of David again. "Or are you just some kind of robot they wind up every morning?" David could feel perspiration beginning to form under his heavy woolen uniform, but not from nervousness. The afternoon was warm for London, and the ceremonial clothing was designed for appearance rather than comfort. His extensive military training had prepared him for situations far more stressful than dealing with one intoxicated civilian. But Tommy misread David's calm professionalism as fear or submission. In the rough neighborhoods where Tommy had grown up, anyone who didn't fight back when challenged was considered weak. Respect was earned through confrontation, and backing down from a fight meant losing face permanently. "My taxes pay for your salary, you know that?" Tommy moved even closer, now standing within arm's reach of David. "That makes me your boss, basically. And I'm telling you to show some respect when a citizen is talking to you." The security guard was getting closer, but was still moving at a measured pace, not wanting to escalate what appeared to be a manageable situation. From his experience, most confrontations like this could be resolved through calm conversation and possibly escorting the intoxicated person away from the area. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only visible sign that he was even aware of Tommy's presence. Years of military discipline and training had taught him that responding to provocation was exactly what troublemakers wanted. Stay professional, stay focused, and let the proper authorities handle problems. That was how the system worked. But Tommy caught that tiny facial movement and interpreted it as a crack in David's composure. "Now I'm getting to you, aren't I?" Tommy grinned, showing teeth that hadn't been properly cleaned in several days. The perfect little soldier boy is starting to get upset. The crowd of tourists had grown significantly now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Some people were posting live updates to their social media accounts, while others were taking photographs to show friends and family. The incident was already beginning to spread online before it had even reached its climax. Tommy stepped even closer, now standing directly in David's personal space with less than 18 inches between them. The crowd of tourists had swollen to at least 50 people now, all drawn by the growing tension between Tommy and the perfectly still guard. What had started as a few curious onlookers snapping photos had transformed into a proper spectacle. People were nudging their friends, pointing at the confrontation and whispering in languages from around the globe. Tommy felt a rush of energy from all the attention. For the first time in days, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't just another failed construction worker stumbling through London with nowhere to go. All these people were watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. The alcohol made this feel exciting rather than embarrassing. "Look at all these people," Tommy announced loudly, gesturing at the growing audience with both arms. "They're all here to see what the big tough guard is going to do when someone stands up to him." He let out a harsh laugh that carried across the courtyard. "But we both know he's not going to do anything, don't we?" David's training had covered crowd dynamics extensively. He understood that intoxicated individuals often became more aggressive and unpredictable when they had an audience, especially one that was recording their behavior. The manual had been very clear about these situations. Never give the provocateur the reaction they're seeking, no matter how personal or insulting their comments become. But Tommy's alcohol-soaked brain was interpreting David's continued silence as absolute proof that his insults were hitting their mark. In the neighborhoods where Tommy had learned about respect and confrontation, staying quiet when someone challenged you meant you were accepting their dominance. It meant you were weak. "You know what your problem is?" Tommy continued, his voice getting louder so everyone in the crowd could hear him clearly. "You think that fancy uniform makes you special. You think standing here like a statue makes you some kind of hero." A middle-aged American woman lowered her camera and looked uncomfortable. She whispered something to her husband about maybe finding a different area to take pictures, but a group of college students nearby seemed thrilled by the drama, holding their phones higher to get better angles of whatever was about to happen. Tommy noticed both reactions and felt more confident with each passing moment. Some people were getting nervous, which meant they recognized his power in this situation. Others were excited, which meant they were expecting him to do something significant. Either way, he was in control. "I bet you failed at everything else in life," Tommy went on, starting to pace back and forth in front of David like a lawyer addressing a jury. "Couldn't make it in a real job, so they stuck you here playing dress-up for tourists. Am I getting warm?" A family with 2 young children quietly gathered their belongings and moved to a different area near the palace gates. The parents had recognized the signs of escalating trouble and wanted to get their kids away from whatever was developing, but their departure was balanced by new arrivals. People who had heard there was some kind of incident happening and came to see what was going on. David remained absolutely motionless, but inside his mind he was processing multiple layers of information. He could track the movement of people in the crowd, identify potential escape routes if the situation became dangerous, and monitor Tommy's increasingly aggressive body language. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure while remaining completely aware of his surroundings. The security guard who had been walking over was now about 30 yards away and had picked up his pace slightly. He was speaking into his radio, probably updating his supervisors about the developing situation, but he was still treating this as a routine incident rather than an emergency. Tommy saw the approaching security and felt a spike of urgency. If he was going to prove his point about these fake soldiers, he needed to do it before someone interrupted his moment of power. "You see that guy coming over here?" Tommy pointed at the security guard without taking his eyes off David. "He's coming to rescue you because you can't handle one regular person having a conversation with you." How embarrassing is that? More people were filming now, and Tommy could see the red recording lights on their phones. This was going to be documented, shared online, maybe even make it onto news programs. The thought made him feel important and dangerous at the same time. "Let me ask you something," Tommy said, stepping so close that David could feel his breath. "Have you ever actually been in a fight? Not some training exercise or war game, but a real fight where someone was trying to hurt you?" David's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle, but his face remained expressionless. The truth was that David had been in several real combat situations during his overseas deployment, including one where his quick thinking and courage had saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers. But he couldn't defend his record without breaking protocol and potentially escalating the situation. Tommy interpreted the slight hand movement as nervousness, rather than restraint. "I thought so," Tommy said with satisfaction. "You've never been tested, have you? Never had to prove yourself when it really mattered. You just stand around looking pretty while real men do the actual work." An elderly British gentleman in the crowd shook his head in disgust and muttered something about shameful behavior to his wife. But a group of teenagers nearby seemed fascinated by the confrontation, recording everything on their phones and occasionally laughing at Tommy's more creative insults. The mix of reactions from his audience only encouraged Tommy further. He was getting emotional responses from people, making them pay attention, forcing them to react to his presence. After feeling powerless and ignored for so long, this taste of influence was intoxicating. "You know what?" Tommy reached out and poked David hard in the chest with his index finger. The contact sent a visible shock through several people in the crowd. "I don't think you're even allowed to move, are you? They probably told you to stand there and take whatever anyone dishes out." The poke crossed a clear line from verbal harassment to physical contact, and David felt his training shift into a higher level of alertness. But he still didn't move or react visibly, which Tommy took as permission to continue. "What happens if I do this?" Tommy poked him again, harder this time, right on one of the shiny brass buttons. "Does the spell break? Do you turn back into a regular person?" Several tourists gasped at the second poke. Some started backing away, finally realizing that they might be witnessing something genuinely dangerous rather than just entertaining. Others moved closer, excited by the escalation and eager to capture it on their phones. David could feel each poke but maintained his position through sheer force of will and training. However, physical contact changed the nature of the threat assessment. His instructors had been very specific about the protocols for handling situations where someone actually touched a guard or their equipment. Tommy noticed the crowd's mixed reactions and felt a surge of power. He was making things happen, creating drama, forcing responses from people who had been treating him as invisible for days. The alcohol made this feel like victory rather than public humiliation. "I know what this is really about," Tommy announced to his audience, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. "This isn't about tradition or service or any of that garbage. This is about making regular people feel small." He poked David a third time, aiming for the red fabric of his jacket. "You stand here in your fancy costume, looking down on everyone who walks by, making us feel like we're not good enough to even talk to you." The third poke was harder than the first two, and it caused David's hat to shift slightly on his head. The crowd reacted with more gasps and nervous murmurs. Some people started moving away more quickly, while others pushed forward to get better views of the confrontation. Tommy was breathing harder now, his face flushed with excitement and alcohol. The combination of attention, adrenaline, and whiskey was creating a dangerous cocktail of confidence and recklessness. "You think you're better than people like me because you wear that uniform?" Tommy continued, his voice getting louder and more hostile. "But you know what? Under all that fancy dress-up, you're just another person. And I don't think you're anything special at all." Without warning, Tommy reached out and grabbed the barrel of David's rifle with his left hand while pointing at him accusingly with his right. The moment Tommy's hand closed around the weapon, everything changed. Several people in the crowd screamed. Others started running immediately, recognizing that touching a soldier's weapon was far more serious than simple harassment. Parents grabbed their children and moved quickly toward the exits, while others pulled out their phones to call for help. David felt the contact with his rifle and experienced an immediate shift in his threat assessment. Someone grabbing a soldier's weapon was considered a serious assault in any context, military or civilian. His training kicked into an even higher level of alertness as he evaluated his options for protecting both his weapon and the innocent civilians surrounding them. But Tommy was too drunk and too caught up in his moment of power to understand what he had just done. In his mind, he had simply proven that the guard wouldn't even defend his own equipment. He thought he was winning this confrontation completely. The security guard was now running, speaking urgently into his radio as he pushed through the panicking crowd. Time seemed to move in slow motion as Tommy stood there with his hand wrapped firmly around the barrel of David's rifle. The cold metal felt real and solid under his grip, more substantial than anything else had felt to him in days. Around them, the crowd was transforming from curious tourists into genuinely frightened people who were starting to understand that they might be witnessing something truly dangerous. But Tommy felt nothing except a wild rush of triumph. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything to stop him from grabbing his weapon. In Tommy's alcohol-confused mind, this was absolute proof that everything he had suspected was true. These guards were just actors in costumes, playing roles for the entertainment of tourists. "Look at this, everybody," Tommy shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls as he gave the rifle a slight shake. "I've got hold of his gun and he's not doing anything about it. What kind of soldier is this supposed to be?" The remaining tourists were now clearly divided into two groups, those who were running away as fast as they could, and those who were too fascinated by the unfolding drama to leave. Parents were pulling children behind barriers. Elderly couples were hurrying toward the exits, and several people were openly talking about calling the police. But a core group of about 20 people remained, most of them young adults with their phones held high, recording every second of Tommy's confrontation with the motionless guard. To them, this looked like the most exciting thing that had happened during their London vacation. David was experiencing something very different from what Tommy imagined. The moment someone grabbed his weapon, every piece of military training he had ever received came flooding back in vivid detail. In combat zones, allowing an enemy to take control of your rifle was often a death sentence. Not just for you, but potentially for everyone around you. But this wasn't a war zone. This was central London, surrounded by innocent civilians who could be hurt if the situation escalated too quickly. David's options were severely limited by the presence of so many people who had nothing to do with this confrontation. He could try to pull the rifle away from Tommy, which might start a physical struggle that could endanger bystanders. He could call for help, which would break his ceremonial silence and potentially escalate Tommy's aggression. Or he could wait for security to arrive and hope they could resolve the situation without violence. Every choice carried serious risks, and David had to make his decision in seconds. Tommy, meanwhile, was getting more excited by the moment. The weight of the rifle in his hand made him feel powerful and dangerous. The crowd's attention was completely focused on him. For the first time since losing his job, he felt like he was in control of something important. "You see what's happening here?" Tommy addressed his audience like a performer on stage. "This is what happens when you challenge these fake soldiers. They can't handle real confrontation from real people." Several people in the crowd were now backing away more quickly, their survival instincts finally overriding their curiosity. A middle-aged woman was speaking urgently into her phone, probably calling for police assistance. Two security guards were pushing through the remaining crowd, but they were still about 15 yards away. Tommy saw the approaching security and felt a spike of urgency mixed with defiance. If they were coming to protect this fake guard, then he needed to prove his point before they could interfere with his moment of truth. "You know what I think happened here?" Tommy continued, his grip tightening on the rifle barrel. "I think they just give these guys empty weapons and tell them to stand around looking important. I bet this thing isn't even loaded." That comment sent a wave of genuine panic through the crowd. Several more people started running immediately, finally understanding that they might be in real danger. The teenagers who had been filming with excitement suddenly looked much more nervous, though most of them kept recording. David's eyes flickered slightly, the first visible sign of emotion he had shown since the entire confrontation began. The rifle was indeed loaded with live ammunition, as all Queen's guards carried functional weapons. Tommy had no idea how close he was to creating a genuine emergency situation that could endanger everyone in the area. The security guards were now running, speaking urgently into their radios as they tried to reach the scene. Additional personnel were converging from multiple directions, their voices creating a buzz of urgent communication that was starting to penetrate even Tommy's alcohol-fogged awareness, but Tommy was too focused on his confrontation with David to pay attention to the approaching help. He was living in a bubble of adrenaline, alcohol, and misplaced confidence that made everything else seem distant and unimportant. "You're pathetic," Tommy said, leaning closer to David's face while maintaining his grip on the rifle. "Standing here like a mannequin while someone takes your weapon away from you. What would your commanding officer say if he could see this?" David's jaw clenched slightly, another tiny sign that he was human rather than a statue. The comment about his commanding officer hit particularly hard because David took his military service seriously. He had worked incredibly hard to earn his position as a Queen's Guard, and the suggestion that he was failing in his duties was deeply painful. But David's training had taught him that responding to provocation was exactly what aggressors wanted. Stay calm, stay professional, and trust the system to handle the situation. That was the protocol, even in circumstances as challenging as this. Tommy saw the jaw clench and interpreted it as fear rather than restraint. "Now I'm really getting to you, aren't I?" Tommy grinned, showing teeth that hadn't been properly brushed in days. The perfect little toy soldier is starting to crack under pressure. The crowd had thinned significantly now, with most of the families and older tourists having fled the area entirely. But the remaining spectators seemed mesmerized by the confrontation, continuing to film and photograph despite the obvious danger of the situation. Tommy felt their attention like a drug. Every camera pointed at him. Every shocked expression, every nervous murmur made him feel more important and powerful than he had in months. The combination of alcohol and adrenaline was creating a perfect storm of poor judgment. "You want to know what I really think about you and your whole royal family?" Tommy said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that only David could hear clearly. "I think you're all just parasites, living off the hard work of people like me while pretending to be something special." Those words crossed a line that Tommy didn't even know existed. David had sworn a sacred oath to serve and protect the crown and the royal family. Hearing them insulted while he stood helpless to respond was one of the most difficult challenges he had ever faced as a soldier. The insult about the royal family was the final straw for David's composure, though he still didn't move or speak. But something changed in his eyes. A flash of genuine anger that lasted only a split second before being suppressed by his iron discipline. Tommy caught that flash of emotion and felt a surge of triumph. He had finally gotten a real reaction from the statue-like guard. Now he just needed to push a little further to completely break the man's facade of professionalism. The security guards were now less than 10 yards away, moving as fast as they could through the remaining crowd. One of them was shouting warnings for people to clear the area, while another was coordinating with additional backup over his radio. But Tommy was beyond caring about consequences now. The combination of alcohol, anger, and the intoxicating feeling of having an audience had pushed him past the point of rational thought. He felt invincible, like he could do anything without facing real repercussions. "What are you going to do about it?" Tommy challenged, staring directly into David's eyes while maintaining his grip on the rifle. "Are you going to arrest me? Fight me? Or just keep standing there like the coward you really are?" The words hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. David's training and professionalism were warring with his natural human instincts to defend himself and his honor. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing the climax of something that had been building for several minutes. Tommy felt the tension and decided to end this confrontation on his own terms. He was tired of waiting for the guard to react. He was tired of being ignored and dismissed. He was tired of feeling powerless in his own life. "You know what?" Tommy said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he finally released the rifle and stepped back slightly. "I don't think you have it in you to do anything about this." And then, in a moment of catastrophic stupidity that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Tommy drew back his right fist and looked David directly in the eye. The crowd around them seemed to stop breathing entirely as they realized what was about to happen. Several people screamed warnings, others covered their eyes, and many continued filming as they witnessed the exact moment when a drunk, Construction worker was about to assault a member of the Queen's Guard in broad daylight. David saw the punch coming and had perhaps 2 seconds to react. His military training had taught him multiple ways to defend himself, block the attack, or neutralize the threat. But he was also acutely aware that he was a Queen's Guard on active duty, representing centuries of British. The moment Tommy's fist connected with David's jaw, it was as if someone had activated a sophisticated machine that had been waiting silently for exactly this trigger. What happened next unfolded with such speed and precision that most of the watching tourists couldn't even process the sequence of events until it was completely over. Within 4 seconds of the punch landing, armed police officers seemed to materialize from thin air around Tommy. They emerged from doorways he hadn't noticed, from behind crowd barriers where they had been positioned as plainclothes security, and from locations in the tourist area where they had been blending in so perfectly that Tommy never suspected their presence. Suddenly, Tommy found himself in the center of a circle formed by 6 officers, all with weapons drawn and pointed directly at him. The transformation from feeling powerful and in control to being surrounded by armed police was so sudden that his alcohol-clouded brain couldn't make sense of what was happening. Armed police. "Get on the ground now." The command came from multiple officers simultaneously, their voices sharp enough to cut through the chaos and loud enough to be heard clearly by everyone still in the area. The remaining tourists, who had been fascinated by the confrontation just moments before, now scattered in genuine panic. Parents grabbed children and ran toward the nearest exits. The teenagers who had been filming with excitement suddenly looked terrified as they realized they were standing in the middle of what had become a serious police operation. Tommy stood frozen in place, his fist still raised from throwing the punch, his mouth hanging open in shock and confusion. The whiskey in his system made everything feel surreal and dreamlike, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold in front of him, rather than living his own reality. "I said get down on the ground." The lead officer was a woman in her 30s with ice-cold eyes, and the kind of voice that suggested she had handled dangerous situations many times before. "Hands where we can see them." But Tommy's brain was struggling to process the dramatic change in his circumstances. One moment he had been feeling triumphant about punching the silent guard, and the next moment he was staring down the barrels of multiple police weapons. The transition was so abrupt that he couldn't connect the two events in his mind. David, meanwhile, remained at his ceremonial post with absolutely incredible composure. Despite having just been punched in the face by a stranger, he had not moved even 1 step from his assigned position. His bearskin hat was slightly crooked from the impact, and there was a small red mark developing on his jaw where Tommy's knuckles had connected. But otherwise he appeared completely unaffected by the assault. This professional response was actually making Tommy's situation much worse. If David had fought back or even moved from his spot, the incident might have looked like a mutual fight between 2 men. But David's perfect discipline made it crystal clear to everyone watching that this was an unprovoked assault on a member of the military who was simply performing his ceremonial duties. "Final warning," another officer shouted, his weapon trained steadily on Tommy's chest. "Get on the ground now or we will put you down." The deadly serious tone of that threat finally penetrated Tommy's alcohol-fogged consciousness. He looked around at the circle of armed officers and realized with growing horror that they were absolutely prepared to use force if he didn't comply immediately. These weren't ordinary street police who might show some patience with a drunk person. These were specialist protection officers, whose job was to defend one of the most important locations in Britain. Tommy slowly began to raise his hands, but he was moving too sluggishly for the officer's liking. His coordination was affected by the alcohol, and his shock at the situation was making him respond more slowly than they expected from someone who might be a genuine threat. 2 officers rushed forward simultaneously and grabbed Tommy's arms, pulling him down onto the wet pavement with enough force to scrape his knees through his pants and jar his shoulder against the ground. The impact knocked some of the wind out of him and finally began to sober him up from his alcohol-induced haze. "Hey, you don't need to be so rough," Tommy protested as cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists behind his back. But his complaints were completely ignored by the officers, who were focused on securing him as quickly and safely as possible. The entire takedown had lasted less than 20 seconds from the moment of the punch to Tommy being handcuffed on the ground. The speed and coordination of the response was absolutely stunning to witness. And the few remaining tourists who had managed to capture it on their phones now had footage of one of the most efficient arrests they would ever see. One of the officers was speaking rapidly into his radio, using codes and terminology that the watching civilians couldn't understand. But the urgency in his voice made it clear that Tommy's assault on the Queen's Guard was being treated as a very serious incident that required immediate attention from multiple levels of law enforcement. You are under arrest for assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, the lead officer announced as she knelt beside Tommy's prone form. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Tommy tried to turn his head to look at her, but one of the officers kept his face pressed firmly against the cold, damp pavement. This is insane, he mumbled into the ground. I just hit the guy once. It's not like I killed someone or planted a bomb. Sir, I strongly advise you to remain silent, the officer replied with professional detachment. You have just committed a serious assault against a serving member of the British Armed Forces while they were performing their official duties. This is not a minor offense. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Tommy started to feel genuinely scared rather than angry or defiant. The officer's words were beginning to penetrate his alcohol-clouded understanding. He hadn't just gotten into a bar fight with some random person. He had attacked a real soldier who was representing the Queen and the entire British military. As the officers lifted Tommy to his feet, he got his first clear look at the aftermath of his moment of rage. The tourist area, which had been packed with families and sightseers just minutes before, was now largely empty except for police personnel and a few brave onlookers watching from a safe distance. David continued to stand at his post as if absolutely nothing had happened. A paramedic had appeared and was trying to examine the red mark on his jaw, but David politely declined medical attention with a slight shake of his head. His professionalism was so complete that he seemed more concerned about maintaining his ceremonial duties than about his own well-being after being assaulted. The contrast between David's calm dignity and Tommy's disheveled, handcuffed state couldn't have been more stark. One man represented honor, discipline, and service to something greater than himself. The other represented the consequences of letting anger and alcohol control your actions. This is completely mental, Tommy said, as the officers began marching him toward a waiting police van. I'm not some kind of terrorist or dangerous criminal. I just had too much to drink and made a stupid mistake. But the lead officer wasn't interested in Tommy's excuses or self-justification. Sir, you assaulted a Queen's Guard in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple security cameras. The severity of your mistake will be determined by a judge, not by your personal opinion of what happened. As they walked him toward the van, Tommy became aware of just how many people had witnessed his moment of catastrophic poor judgment. There had to be at least 100 tourists in the broader area when the incident occurred, and many of them had been recording with their phones or cameras. His face and his actions were already spreading across social media platforms around the world. The police van was parked just outside the palace gates, and Tommy could see several more officers and official vehicles that had responded to the incident. This wasn't just a simple arrest for drunk and disorderly conduct. It was a major security response to what they clearly considered a serious threat to public safety and royal security. Please, watch your head, one of the officers said with professional courtesy. As they helped Tommy into the back of the van, the interior was specifically designed for transporting prisoners, with thick metal mesh separating the front and rear compartments and no door handles on the inside. As the van doors slammed shut with a final, echoing clang, Tommy was left alone with his thoughts for the first time since the confrontation had begun. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening after all the shouting, radio chatter, and crowd noise from the arrest scene. Through the small reinforced window, Tommy could see David still standing perfectly at his ceremonial post. Other tourists were already beginning to gather around him again, taking pictures and asking questions as if Tommy's assault had been nothing more than a brief interruption in their London sightseeing experience, but Tommy's life had been changed forever in those few minutes of drunken aggression. He was sitting in the back of a police van, facing serious criminal charges, and his moment of stupidity had been recorded by dozens of cameras and phones. The videos would probably be playing on news channels and social media within hours. The police station was nothing like the chaotic, noisy places Tommy had seen in movies and television shows. Instead of criminals shouting and officers rushing around, he found himself in a quiet, sterile environment that felt more like a doctor's office than a jail. The fluorescent lights were harsh and clinical, and everything smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. The booking process began immediately and was carried out with methodical precision. A desk sergeant with gray hair and tired eyes that had clearly seen thousands of arrests took Tommy's personal information, photographed him from multiple angles, and pressed his fingers onto an electronic scanner that recorded his fingerprints in a computer database. "Have you consumed any alcohol or drugs in the past 24 hours?" the sergeant asked, filling out forms on his computer without looking up at Tommy. "I've been drinking," Tommy admitted, though the alcohol was wearing off now and his head was starting to clear. The sobering reality of his situation was replacing the whiskey-fueled confidence that had gotten him into this mess. "But I wasn't that drunk. I knew exactly what I was doing." The sergeant paused and looked at Tommy directly for the first time since the booking process had begun. "Son, that's probably not something you want to emphasize right now. Claiming you were sober when you assaulted a Queen's Guard doesn't help your case, it makes it worse." Tommy was beginning to realize that every word he spoke was being noted and could potentially be used against him later in court. But it was too late to take back what he had already said, and the sergeant was already moving on to the next part of the procedure. "Empty all your pockets completely and place everything in this plastic tray," the sergeant instructed, sliding a gray container across the counter. Tommy pulled out his wallet, phone, house keys, and some loose change. He was surprised when they also took his belt and shoelaces, explaining that these items could be potential safety hazards in the holding cell. "Why are you taking my shoelaces?" Tommy asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Standard procedure for anyone being held on serious charges," the sergeant replied matter-of-factly. "We don't take any chances with prisoner safety." The holding cell was a small concrete room painted institutional green, with a metal bench bolted to one wall and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. There were no windows, just a single fluorescent light that buzzed constantly overhead and cast everything in harsh, unflattering shadows. Tommy sat on the hard metal bench and tried to make sense of what had just happened to his life. The silence in the cell was complete except for the electrical humming of the light fixture and occasional footsteps in the corridor outside. For the first time in hours, he had nothing to distract him from thinking about his actions and their consequences. The more he thought about it, the worse his situation seemed. He had assaulted a soldier in front of hundreds of witnesses at one of the most secure locations in the country. There was video evidence of everything he had done, recorded by dozens of tourist phones and security cameras, and he had done it all while knowing exactly what he was doing, which meant he couldn't even claim that alcohol had impaired his judgment. Hours passed before anyone came to speak with him. During that time, Tommy had plenty of opportunity to replay the events at Buckingham Palace in his mind, and each time he remembered something new that made his situation look worse. He remembered grabbing David's rifle, remembered the crowd backing away in fear, remembered the look of shock and disgust on people's faces when he threw the punch. When the cell door finally opened with a loud clang, two people entered the small interrogation room where Tommy was brought to wait. The first was a police detective in a rumpled suit, who looked like he had been working long hours on difficult cases. The second was a woman in professional business attire who introduced herself as his court-appointed legal representative. "Mr. Blake?" the lawyer said, sitting across from him at a small metal table and opening a thick folder. "My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I've been assigned to represent you in this matter. Before we discuss anything else, I need you to understand exactly how serious the charges are that you're facing." She began reading from an official document, and each charge hit Tommy like a physical blow. "You're being charged with assault occasioning actual bodily harm against a member of the armed forces, breach of public order in the vicinity of a royal residence, threatening behavior likely to cause harassment or distress, interfering with a member of the military in the lawful execution of their duties, and public intoxication." Tommy felt his stomach drop as the list continued. "That sounds like way more than just punching someone once." "That's because what you did was much more serious than just punching someone," Ms. Walsh replied, her tone professional but not unsympathetic. When you assault a Queen's Guard, you're not just attacking an individual person. You're committing an offense against a representative of the Crown and the entire British military establishment. The law treats this very differently from a typical bar fight. The detective, who had been listening quietly while taking notes, leaned forward across the table. The guard you assaulted is Guardsman David Chen, a decorated veteran who served 2 combat tours overseas before being selected for this prestigious ceremonial position. He has an exemplary military record, has never been in trouble with the law, and volunteers his free time working with disadvantaged youth in his community. This information hit Tommy harder than any of the formal charges. In his alcohol-fueled rage at the palace, he had imagined David as some kind of privileged rich kid playing dress-up for tourists. Learning that he was actually a combat veteran and community volunteer made Tommy's actions seem not just criminal, but deeply shameful. "What kind of punishment am I looking at?" Tommy asked, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. Ms. Walsh flipped through several pages in her folder, consulting legal precedents and sentencing guidelines. Assault occasioning actual bodily harm against a member of the armed forces can carry up to 6 months imprisonment. The additional charges related to the royal residence and public order could add more jail time and substantial financial penalties. You're also looking at a permanent criminal record that will affect your employment prospects and travel opportunities for years to come. Tommy put his head in his hands, trying to process the magnitude of what he was facing. 6 months in prison? I can't survive 6 months in jail. I'll lose my apartment, I've already lost my job, and this will destroy any chance I have of rebuilding my life. I understand this is overwhelming, Ms. Walsh said, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice. But I have to be completely honest with you about the seriousness of your situation. The Crown Prosecution Service takes cases like this very seriously. They're going to argue that your assault on a Queen's Guard represents an attack on fundamental British institutions and traditions. The detective added more disturbing news. We've also been informed that video footage of the incident has already gone viral on social media platforms. Multiple news outlets are preparing stories about what happened, and several have already published articles that include your name and photograph. Tommy looked up in horror. My name is in the newspapers? Multiple newspapers, television news programs, and online news sites, the detective confirmed. The story is being covered internationally because it involves the Queen's Guards, who are recognized symbols of Britain around the world. Your actions have attracted attention far beyond just London. This was Tommy's worst nightmare coming to life. Not only was he facing serious criminal charges and potential prison time, but his moment of drunken stupidity was being broadcast around the globe. His family would see it. His former co-workers would see it. And anyone who ever searched for his name online in the future would find videos of him being arrested at Buckingham Palace. Ms. Walsh continued reviewing the evidence against him. There's also the matter of your behavior leading up to the actual assault. Multiple witnesses have provided detailed statements about your verbal harassment of Guardsman Chen, your interference with his ceremonial duties, and your inappropriate physical contact with his weapon. I barely touched his rifle, Tommy protested weakly. You grabbed the barrel of a loaded military weapon carried by a serving soldier. The detective corrected him firmly. In different circumstances, that action alone could have been treated as attempted disarming of military personnel, which carries even more serious penalties. Tommy was beginning to understand that every single thing he had done during his confrontation with David was going to work against him in court. There was no part of his behavior that could be explained away, justified, or minimized. What about the fact that I was drinking? Tommy asked desperately. Doesn't that count as some kind of mitigating circumstance? I wasn't thinking clearly because of the alcohol. Ms. Walsh shook her head sadly. Public intoxication is not a legal defense for criminal behavior. Mr. Blake, if anything, it might work against you because it suggests poor judgment and a potential alcohol dependency that makes you a danger to public safety. The meeting continued for another hour as Ms. Walsh explained the legal process that lay ahead of him. There would be an initial court appearance where the charges would be formally read, and the courtroom was packed beyond capacity with reporters, curious members of the public, legal students, and what seemed like half the justice system of London. Tommy sat beside Ms. Walsh at the defendant's table, wearing the only clean shirt he owned and trying desperately not to look at all the people staring at him like he was some kind of dangerous animal in a zoo. The past 8 weeks since his arrest had been the most difficult and humiliating period of Tommy's entire life. He had been released on bail the day after the incident, but the conditions of his release had made normal life practically impossible. Besides being banned from going anywhere near royal properties, he also had to report to a probation officer twice weekly and attend mandatory alcohol counseling sessions every Tuesday evening. The media attention had been absolutely relentless and devastating. The video of him punching David and being arrested had been viewed over 15 million times across various social media platforms. News outlets from around the world had picked up the story, with headlines like "Drunk Construction," "Worker Attacks Royal Guard," and "Tourists Shocking Assault on Queen's Soldier." His face was now instantly recognizable to strangers on the street. Finding employment had become completely impossible. Every potential employer who bothered to interview him would inevitably search his name online and immediately discover the viral videos and news coverage of his arrest. Construction companies, retail stores, delivery services, cleaning companies. Everyone turned him down the moment they realized who he was and what he had done. His landlord, Mr. Peterson, had initially been understanding about Tommy's legal troubles. But when newspaper reporters and television crews started showing up at the apartment building, trying to get interviews with Tommy, the other tenants began complaining loudly to the building management. Tommy was eventually forced to break his lease early and move back in with his 70-year-old mother in her small council flat on the other side of London. The relationship with his mother was complicated and painful. She was deeply disappointed in his behavior, but she was also the only person in the world who still cared about his well-being. She had watched the news coverage with a mixture of shame and heartbreak, and she made it very clear that Tommy needed to completely change his life. "I raised you better than this," she had said during one of their most difficult conversations, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Your father fought in the army, and he would be absolutely ashamed if he were alive to see what you've done to that young soldier." Those words had cut deeper than any of the legal consequences Tommy was facing. During the weeks leading up to the trial, Tommy had learned much more about David Chen through news reports, court documents, and social media posts from people who knew him. Far from being the privileged pretender Tommy had imagined, David was revealed to be an exceptional young man who had dedicated his life to serving others. David had grown up in a working-class family, earned his position in the Queen's Guard through merit and hard work, and spent his free time volunteering at a youth center, helping troubled teenagers avoid the kind of mistakes Tommy had made. He was also studying part-time for a degree in social work, planning to transition from military service to helping disadvantaged communities after his tour of duty ended. This information made Tommy feel progressively worse about his actions as each new detail emerged. David wasn't just an innocent victim of Tommy's drunken rage. He was actually someone who spent his life trying to make the world a better place for people, exactly like Tommy. The trial itself was swift and decisive, largely because there was overwhelming evidence of Tommy's guilt. The prosecution had security camera footage from multiple angles, phone videos recorded by dozens of tourists, witness statements from people in the crowd, testimony from the police officers who made the arrest, and even social media posts that Tommy had made in the days leading up to the incident complaining about his job loss and his anger at authority figures. Ms. Walsh had strongly advised Tommy to plead guilty and hope for judicial mercy, but Tommy had initially wanted to fight the charges. He thought maybe he could argue that excessive alcohol consumption had impaired his judgment, or that David's refusal to respond to provocation had somehow contributed to the escalation. But as the overwhelming evidence was presented piece by piece, Tommy realized how ridiculous and offensive those arguments would sound to any reasonable person. The videos clearly showed him as the sole aggressor in every aspect of the confrontation. David had never said or done anything that could remotely be considered provocative or threatening. The most devastating moment of the entire trial came when David himself took the witness stand to testify about the incident. He appeared in his dress uniform, stood at attention when addressing the court, and spoke with the kind of quiet dignity and professionalism that made Tommy's behavior look even more shameful by comparison. David described the events clearly and factually, never showing any anger toward Tommy or desire for revenge. He simply explained what had happened, how he had tried to follow his training and maintain his composure throughout the increasingly aggressive confrontation, and how he had chosen not to defend himself physically because his duty was to maintain his ceremonial post. "How did you feel about the defendant's actions?" the prosecutor asked during direct examination. David considered the question carefully before answering. "I felt sorry for him, honestly. He seemed like someone who was having a very difficult time in his life and made some extremely poor choices as a result. I hope he's able to get the help he needs to address whatever problems led him to behave that way." David's compassion and maturity in the face of being assaulted made Tommy's actions appear even more inexcusable. Here was a young man who had been attacked while simply doing his job, and he was still concerned about his attacker's well-being rather than seeking punishment or revenge. The judge presiding over the case was an experienced woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see through every excuse and justification. During the sentencing hearing, she addressed Tommy directly about the seriousness of his actions and their impact on both the victim and society as a whole. "Mr. Blake," she began, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent dealing with criminals and their excuses, "you have pleaded guilty to a serious assault against a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while he was performing his ceremonial duties representing the Crown and the finest traditions of British military service." Tommy tried to listen respectfully, but each word felt like a physical blow to his already battered self-respect. This was not a spontaneous moment of passion or a misunderstanding between two people, the judge continued. The evidence shows that this was a sustained campaign of verbal harassment, physical intimidation, and ultimately violence against someone who was serving his country with honor, discipline, and remarkable restraint. The judge reviewed the evidence that had been presented during the trial, including Tommy's grabbing of David's rifle, his escalating verbal abuse, and his final decision to punch a man who had never responded to any of his provocations. "While you were drinking yourself into a state of rage and looking for someone to blame for your personal failures," the judge said, "Guardsman Chen was representing the very best of what it means to serve something greater than oneself. The contrast between your behavior and his could not be more stark." The judge sentenced Tommy to 4 months in prison, a fine of $2,500, and 250 hours of community service to be completed after his release. She also imposed a restraining order preventing him from going within 500 meters of any royal residence for the next 5 years, and ordered him to attend alcohol abuse counseling for a minimum of 1 year. "I hope you use your time in prison to seriously reflect on your actions and to address the alcohol dependency and anger management issues that led you to this courtroom," the judge concluded. "You are a young man who still has the opportunity to make something positive of your life, but only if you take full responsibility for your choices and commit to becoming a better person." As Tommy was led away in handcuffs to begin his prison sentence, he caught sight of his mother in the public gallery. She was crying quietly, and that image burned itself into his memory more painfully than any of the judge's words or the prospect of months behind bars. Prison was exactly as difficult and dangerous as Tommy had feared it would be. He was housed with other men who had committed various crimes, ranging from theft and fraud to assault and drug dealing. His case had been so widely publicized that most of the other inmates knew exactly who he was and what he had done. Some of them thought his assault on a Queen's Guard was amusing or even admirable, viewing it as a blow against authority and the establishment. But others, particularly those who had military backgrounds or family members in the armed forces, viewed Tommy with open contempt and disgust. Tommy quickly learned to keep a low profile and avoid drawing any attention to himself. He spent most of his time reading books from the prison library, attending the mandatory counseling sessions, and trying to stay out of trouble with both the guards and the other inmates. The counseling sessions were particularly challenging because they forced Tommy to be completely honest about his behavior. 8 months after walking out of prison, Tommy Blake sat in a circle of plastic chairs in a community center basement that smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. The Tuesday evening addiction support group had become the most important part of his week, not because he was required to attend anymore, but because he had volunteered to help other people avoid making the same devastating mistakes he had made. "My name is Tommy," he said when it was his turn to speak, the words coming more easily now after months of practice. "And I'm here because I let alcohol and anger completely destroy my life in the span of 30 seconds. Around the circle sat 12 other people, men and women of various ages, all struggling with addiction and the wreckage it had created in their lives. Some were court-ordered to attend these sessions, just as Tommy had been during his early recovery. Others, like him now, came voluntarily because they understood they needed ongoing support to stay on the right path. "I want to tell you about the worst day of my life," Tommy continued, looking around at faces that reflected his own past struggles with shame, anger, and self-destruction. "Not because I enjoy reliving it, but because maybe hearing about my mistakes will help someone here make better choices." Tommy had told this story dozens of times now, but it never became easier to share. He described losing his job due to his aggressive behavior, his girlfriend leaving because she was afraid of his temper, the drinking that followed, and the rage that built up inside him until it exploded in the most public and humiliating way possible. "The thing that still amazes me," Tommy said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "is how completely wrong I was about everything. I thought I was the victim in my own life story. I blamed my boss for firing me, my girlfriend for leaving, the world for treating me unfairly. But the truth was that I was the problem in every single situation." A young man named Robert, who reminded Tommy uncomfortably of his former self, raised his hand tentatively. "But didn't you feel like you had to stand up for yourself? When people disrespect you, don't you have to show them you won't take it?" Tommy nodded with understanding. "That's exactly how I felt, Robert. But here's what I learned the hard way. David Chen never disrespected me. He was just doing his job with incredible professionalism. I was the one who took his discipline and self-control as some kind of personal insult against me." The group facilitator, a recovered addict named Claire who had been sober for 9 years, smiled encouragingly. "Tommy, tell them what you discovered about Guardsman Chen after the incident." This was always the most difficult part of Tommy's story to share, because it forced him to confront how completely he had misjudged the man he attacked. "After my arrest and during the trial, I learned the truth about David Chen. He wasn't some privileged kid playing soldier like I had imagined. He was a decorated combat veteran who had served overseas in dangerous places, risking his life to protect people like me." Tommy paused, remembering the shame he had felt when these facts first came to light during his legal proceedings. "While I was sitting in bars complaining about my problems and drinking away my paycheck, David was volunteering at youth centers, helping troubled kids build better lives. He was studying social work in his spare time so he could continue serving his community even after his military career ended." An older woman named Patricia, who had been attending the group for several months, asked a question that Tommy heard frequently. "Do you ever feel angry that the punishment was so severe? 4 months in prison seems harsh for one moment of poor judgment." "Patricia," Tommy replied thoughtfully, 4 months in prison was actually the smallest part of my punishment. The real consequences have lasted much longer and run much deeper than anything the court system imposed on me." Tommy went on to describe the 1.5 years since his arrest, the complete inability to find legitimate employment, because employers could easily discover the viral videos of his assault and arrest, the humiliation of having to move back in with his elderly mother at age 28, the loss of friendships and romantic relationships because people didn't want to be associated with someone famous for attacking a soldier. But the worst consequence, Tommy said, wasn't any of the external stuff. It was realizing that I had become someone I didn't recognize, the kind of person who would hurt an innocent man simply because my own life wasn't going well. I had turned into everything I claimed to hate about bullies and abusers. The room was quiet now, with everyone listening intently to Tommy's words. These were people who understood the shame of hitting rock bottom and the difficulty of climbing back up from complete personal failure. "So what changed?" asked Robert. "How did you get from that lowest point to where you are now?" Tommy smiled slightly, thinking about the long and difficult journey from his release from prison to this moment. "Prison counseling helped me understand my problems, but the real change came when I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started focusing on helping other people. I realized that David Chen had shown me what real strength actually looks like. After his release from prison, Tommy had struggled for months to find any kind of work at all. His criminal record, combined with his internet notoriety, made him unemployable in traditional jobs. Finally, a small charity organization that helped formerly homeless people had given him a chance. partly because they specialized in hiring people with criminal backgrounds who were trying to rebuild their lives. The job was in their community kitchen, preparing and serving meals to people who had even less than Tommy did. The work didn't pay much above minimum wage, but it gave Tommy something he had never experienced before, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own problems and complaints. Working with homeless people and recovering addicts taught me something crucial, Tommy told the group. Everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. Everyone has made mistakes and everyone deserves a chance to do better. I had spent years thinking the world owed me something, when really I owed the world something. That realization had gradually led Tommy to start volunteering with addiction counseling groups and anger management programs. He discovered that sharing his story, as embarrassing and shameful as it was, could actually help other people recognize the warning signs in their own lives and make better choices. The viral video of my arrest will exist on the internet forever, Tommy said matter-of-factly. My name will always be connected to that moment of stupidity when I attacked an innocent man. But I've learned that I can't change my past. I can only work on making my future better than my mistakes. Claire, the group facilitator, nodded approvingly. Tommy, why don't you share the recent development with Guardsman Chen? This was a story that Tommy was still processing emotionally. Through his lawyer, he had written a detailed letter of apology to David Chen several months earlier, not expecting any kind of response. The letter had taken him weeks to write, because he wanted it to be completely honest about his actions and their impact. Without making excuses or asking for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter back from David, Tommy said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his wallet. He wrote that he had forgiven me long ago and that he hoped I was getting the help I needed to build a better life. He even said he would be willing to meet with me sometime if I thought it would help with my ongoing recovery. The letter had brought Tommy to tears when he first read it. Here was someone he had publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and probably caused professional difficulties for, and David's primary concern was still Tommy's well-being and personal growth. That letter taught me the difference between someone with genuine character and the person I used to be, Tommy explained. David Chen responded to being attacked by showing compassion and hope for my future. I responded to losing my job by looking for someone to blame and hurt. The contrast shows exactly why his life has meaning and purpose, while mine nearly ended in complete failure. As the group session concluded and people began gathering their belongings, Robert approached Tommy privately with a question that went to the heart of recovery and redemption. Do you think you'll ever be able to completely move past this and have a normal life again? Robert asked. Will there ever come a time when this incident stops defining who you are? Tommy considered the question carefully before answering. Robert, I don't actually want to go back to being normal the way I was before this happened. The person I was before that day at Buckingham Palace was selfish, angry, and destructive. He hurt people emotionally and took no responsibility for the damage he caused. Tommy paused, thinking about how much his perspective on life had changed through his experiences with consequences, recovery, and service to others. The assault and everything that followed were terrible, but they forced me to become a better human being than I ever was before. I've learned that real strength isn't about fighting back or proving yourself through violence. It's about taking responsibility for your mistakes and working every day to help other people. Walking home to his mother's flat that evening, Tommy reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that gray Thursday afternoon when he drunkenly wandered toward Buckingham Palace.